there, and then it went. Will I be able to hear myself over the speakers? Okay, start now. Okay, I will. All right, so everybody's there? Good. Okay. All right, I'm sorry for all of this stuff. I'm not exactly the most technologically inclined here. So I'm hanging up here, and I'm just going to do this directly. Now, I can't hear you. I could for a minute, but I can't hear you now. So I'm just going to go ahead and do this presentation, and we'll go from there. All right, so this is a difficult subject to talk about because there isn't a lot of good research and there isn't a lot of experience with this problem, with this dealing with the volunteers. So what you're going to see is sort of a collection of information that's in various other places, and I've sort of put it together here. I cannot say that this has been all researched. I cannot say that this will always work, but it's basically the level of understanding that we have at this point. So to start off with, there are lots of issues that deal with trying to mobilize resources after a disaster, and I'm going to focus on just the personnel part of this. So there are obviously other things that have to happen besides getting volunteers and coordinating volunteers, but that's what we're going to focus on today. So there's going to be a discussion about the three different kinds of volunteers that we have. If you look at the bottom of the screen, they're basically listed in three groups. These are individuals who spontaneously respond, and this is the majority of the time in what I'm going to talk about. And these are the ones that there's the least amount of evidence on how to manage these individuals, but we'll talk about that. We'll also discuss local organizations, and these are things like religious groups in your area or various volunteer organizations that are already established that might respond. And then, of course, we'll talk a little bit about the larger formal relief organizations that are usually national or even international that respond. So as a sort of background to all this, as I said earlier, there really isn't much in the way of evidence or experience in dealing with volunteers. And matter of fact, most, if you looked at a little bit older publications and you talk to experts that have been around a while, they will tell you that they view people just showing up to volunteer as actually being a problem. This is something that they felt was a problem they had to fix rather than a resource that could be perhaps used to help them. And this started to change in the 1990s with the International Decade for Natural Disaster Reduction, that's IDNDR. That was a UN-sponsored 10-year project to try and reduce the impact of disasters worldwide. That was followed by events across the globe. One was the World Trade Center in 2001, and the other was the Southeast Asian tsunami in 2004. Those really demonstrated the limitations of outside assistance and how long it takes to get aid to a disaster zone, and the potential for using those people who survive as a potential source of help. When you think about large-scale disasters, tsunamis, earthquakes, that sort of thing, even though they kill many people, it's still the most of the citizens in the area survive. So there are always going to be survivors that can volunteer, and if you could somehow utilize these individuals, you could provide at least early assistance fairly quickly. So as people realized that volunteers may actually not be a problem, but could be something that's good, they've tried to come up with recommendations on how one would try and manage this group, which everyone acknowledges is very difficult to manage. So to make sure that we're all talking about the same thing, I wanted to sort of give a working definition of what we're talking about when we say spontaneous volunteers. And so a spontaneous volunteer would be either individuals or even a group of individuals that come to a disaster scene and want to help, but they are not associated with any existing response system, any formal group. They're just individuals who show up. Oftentimes they may have lost family members as well, and they're wanting to participate because it'll help them with their own grief. But they really want to help, but they don't have any association with any existing response group. They also may not even be from the community. Sometimes they're from communities that survived the earthquake or the disaster, and they know that there's problems, so they leave their community and come to the side of the disaster to try to help. And also these individuals, while they may actually have some skills, many of them are completely unknown. We don't know what they have to offer. We don't know if they're basically workers in a restaurant, or if they're physicians, or if they're engineers. We have no idea what their skill set is. And so those are the kinds of people that frequently will be there very quickly after disaster, and something we try to work with. And this is sort of the challenge we face. This is an image of actually a beer party in Europe, but it gives you an idea. This is not really an exaggeration. This is the kinds and numbers of people that would show up and ask for aid. And you can see this could be very difficult to try and organize a group of this size to do something other than cause problems. So what I'm going to try to present is some tools you can consider that could harness some of these individuals and actually turn them into helpful volunteers. So some of the issues that will come up as you begin to sit down and work with other people in your areas and in your countries to try to resolve some of these problems is to recognize that first of all, the people who do show up, the spontaneous volunteers, actually bring a lot of energy to the disaster. They want to help. They will do virtually anything you tell them to do. So they're very motivated, they really care about what's going on, and they want to help. So that's really a good thing. Some of the downside to this is they may lack certain training, and they're not going to be part of an organization. So how to fit them in to the response can be a bit challenging. There will be large numbers of them frequently that will show up, and if you don't have a plan already in place on what you're going to do with them, it can really be difficult for the people who are trying to manage the disaster. And in fact, it can overwhelm them if they don't have a system already in place, and then they lose the opportunity that these volunteers offer. They lose the chance to use them. And so what we want to do is try to view this in a way and create some sort of simple system that would empower, that would allow you to use spontaneous volunteers without overwhelming the traditional responders. Now, and again, in looking at where we have been, not necessarily where we want to go, but if you look at the past, often there have been no pre-event management strategies for spontaneous volunteers. So that when this happens, the emergency managers are overwhelmed. They don't have any plans, and you can't do this after the fact. If you don't have this already set up, you're not going to be able to make it work. So you need some sort of pre-event management strategy. How are we going to look at these people and make them, turn them into useful providers? Part of this has been complicated not only by the lack of plans before the event, but if you ask the average emergency manager, They don't even think it's their problem. They don't think it's their responsibility to supervise volunteers. That should be somebody else's issue. And so they don't want to develop pre-event plans. They don't want to create a system to do this because they don't think it's their problem. And therefore, they don't have any clue as to what to do with them. There's no guidance, and they don't know who should supervise them, where they should go, et cetera, et cetera. So these are sort of the environment that that we find ourselves in as we sort of begin to structure us. So the first thing you have to do in trying to lay this out is sort of identify what are the issues that we need to address. If you're going to use these spontaneous volunteers, what are the various issues we have to address in order to make this work? And so you see a list in front of you. These are not all the issues, but they're most of them. There has to be a way to actually identify them, register them, because you're going to assign them certain tasks. There's a certain amount of risk involved in being in a disaster scene. So you need to know who you're working with. So you have to have some basic information who they are, and you also have to credential them. What skills do they have? If they say they're a doctor, do they have a doctor's license on them? A lot of doctors carry identification on their person. In my wallet, I have my card that's issued by the state of California that says I'm a doctor, and many places will have something like that. But you need to identify what their skills are. You need to have some sense of what the liability situation is. Now, obviously, in America, we sue everybody for anything, but beyond that, people have responsibilities to do the right thing. And what happens if a volunteer who means well, but inadvertently hurts somebody or does damage to something? Who's responsible for that? And that has to be worked out beforehand. We need a system of command and control. So if we're going to use volunteers, how do we coordinate this? We have to have some kind of command structure. And we need a management system that will allow us to effectively send volunteers to various areas and tell them what to do and have them report back. So there needs to be some management and specific leadership. Who's going to run the show? That all has to be decided beforehand. There may be some minimal training under what we call just-in-time training. You're not going to do this. It'd be good to do it before the event, but oftentimes you can't. You have to do it right there. So some easy, quick kind of training, and then security. These areas can be somewhat dangerous, and so providing security is important. And then also the support services that are necessary. Obviously, if you're going to put together a quick search and rescue team that's going to do very light search and rescue, nothing big, but some what we call light search and rescue, they're going to need some supplies, shovels, ropes, things like that. So the kind of support equipment and services would be necessary. Those things are part of this sort of global plan that one wants to think about if one is going to try to manage these volunteers. So to start this process, okay, and it's a big process. This is not something that you can do overnight. It takes time. One of the first things you'll need to do is to meet with the groups that are likely, not the volunteers, but organized groups that are going to respond to an event. So each country has different groups that are likely to do this. And so I'm not familiar with the organizations in each and every country, but in many places there is either a Red Cross or Red Crescent local group. There are usually religious groups in almost all countries, and there's oftentimes some local organizations in the United States. They're called disaster medical assistance teams. Other places have other groups, but these are made up of local volunteers who are organized, not spontaneous volunteers. They're organized into groups. And so it's useful to meet with them and find out what their needs are. If we're going to organize spontaneous volunteers into an effective force, what are the things they might need? So they'll give us some idea of what kind of partnerships and what kind of needs they might have, that these volunteers could help with. And once that's identified, then you want to find groups within your own community. Usually it's at the city level. It could be at a ministerial level, depending on the size of the country. But identifying groups who would participate, health, other countries, it might be somebody from the emergency operations group, a public health person, but somebody needs to decide that this is their project, and they will be the leader that will help with the coordination of this whole process. So one of the things after meeting with the groups that are already organized, such as a religious group or perhaps a Red Crescent team or a Red Cross team, um, it's good to identify key contacts in these areas. In addition, it's probably a good idea to reach out to some national organizations. That's a little harder to do because they are less likely to want to talk to individuals on a local level, but their goal is to try and be as effective as they can. And if you actually represent your city or your region, they will probably talk to you at some level, and they can give you some idea of who in their group might be a key contact. This is useful as you're trying to organize the local volunteers. As these groups start to respond, if you don't know anybody in these groups, it's very hard to coordinate what you have with your volunteers with these larger established groups. So identifying key contacts, at least in some, obviously you can't do all of them, but in some that are likely to respond to your area would be a good idea. So once sort of you've identified people in your region who might be helpful in putting a team together and coordinating all this activity, and you sort of have a list of key contacts, you need to put together something called a volunteer coordination team. And this is the group at the local level that's going to actually put this into practice, is going to actually create a system for managing the volunteers. The members should be from some of the people you've already established in your group. Going back a slide, we talked about trying to find people in the community that could help sort of with an overall design and coordination of the project. Those individuals would form a team led by one individual and actually start putting this in place. And they would essentially create this entity, the volunteer coordination team, and they would be responsible for actually putting this in place. So you started sort of review here a little bit. You start sort of globally. You understand what your problems are. You meet with various groups that are going to respond to give you ideas and some ideas of what they need and how they might help. And then you look within your own community. You find key players. You put them together as this volunteer coordination team, and you get ready to move forward. There are a couple of issues to keep in mind as you have the formation of this volunteer coordination team. We talked a little bit about liability, but one of the things that they need to decide is how are we going to protect these volunteers in the sense of if they hurt themselves, is the government going to provide them with some sort of health insurance if they hurt themselves? Some places, they're on their own. You volunteer, we don't provide you with anything, and if you get hurt or you die, that's your problem. Other places that may have a few better, more money may be able to say, we will give you some sort of insurance that if something happens to you, will help pay for your bills. Those are the kind of things that this volunteer coordination team has to look at and make some decisions about. How are we going to protect the volunteers, if we're even going to protect the volunteers? We may not. What happens if the volunteers do cause damage to something? They destroy evidence if it's a crime like a terrorist attack, or they inadvertently hurt someone else while they're trying to help. What's going to happen with that? Those things have to be worked out beforehand. And there are things in certain countries called Good Samaritan laws that sort of protect people who volunteer, but those are usually not enough, and one has to think more detailed about how much we're going to protect volunteers and how we're going to protect the public if a volunteer does damage by accident. So when you're ready to actually begin moving forward and you've looked at some of these issues, you have the volunteer coordination team actually write a plan that will bring structure to the method of creating and utilizing these volunteers. And it has to be, as this team is writing this plan, they need to be a formal part of the Emergency Operations Center, the EOC. It may not be called an EOC in every country, but there's often some entity that in a disaster takes responsibility for coordinating the entire response. And this volunteer coordination team has to have a formal relationship to that group so that they work in together with the EOC to provide an effective response. So what the best way that people have come up with to date on how to do this is to actually create some kind of volunteer reception center so that these volunteer coordination teams, the VCT, this planning group, will then identify places in the area that will be responsible for sort of coordinating at the local level where these responders, the volunteers, will come and be credentialed and deployed. These centers can be even mobile trailers. It can be anything you want it to be. It depends on what works for your community. For instance, if I used my community in Los Angeles, thinking about earthquakes, it probably wouldn't be a good idea to try to identify a building to put this in, because after an earthquake, we have no idea if the building would be even functional, and we have no idea where the earthquake actually would do the most damage. So it would probably be more useful to have some sort of mobile device, a trailer or whatever, that could then be deployed by members of the volunteer coordination team to the areas that are hard hit, and then begin utilizing the volunteers in that area. And these would be where the public would report. If they want to help, they would go to the disaster zone, and these trailers or whatever you use would be identified before the event, and they would go there to start to form some sort of organizational response to this. You would need to have these individuals registered here. They would need some basic documents that you fill out when they're there, only to track this. Again, there's not a lot of time for paperwork. We're not talking about 30-page forms. We're talking about a name, maybe some sort of identification, either depending on each country may have various ways. In the U.S., you have driver's licenses or social security numbers. Every country usually has something that you could use to identify an individual, just to have some basic idea of who you are supervising and a way to find out who they are. And then you would also need to identify the kinds of tasks you want the volunteers to do. I'll get to that in a minute. They're not going to be very sophisticated, but they're very necessary. So these are the kinds of things that a volunteer reception center would coordinate. These are the actual processes that would go on at whatever kind of structure you use. For instance, if you are worried about something like a tsunami, if that's a big risk where you are, then a building on higher ground would actually be an excellent place to hold one of these reception centers. So buildings can work. It just depends on the kinds of disasters you're trying to deal with. But these are the functions that one of these volunteer reception centers would need in some fashion. Again, it doesn't have to be very detailed, but some minimal way of at least registering people and getting them oriented into what they're supposed to do. Make sure they have the qualifications. If they're going to be doing light search and rescue, they obviously have to be fairly fairly strong and able to use their bodies easily. So if they have bad arthritis, you don't want them to be on an urban search and rescue team. They need some concept of safety. These scenes are dangerous. In the Oklahoma City bombing in the U.S., there was an outpouring of local volunteers. It was uncoordinated, and one of the volunteers was killed when a piece of the building fell off and hit her on the head during the very early minutes after the explosion. So these areas can be dangerous, and if you're going to use volunteers, a minimal amount of safety discussion has to go on so that the volunteers don't themselves become victims. As I said earlier, there needs to be some very minimal job training that'll probably have to be done after the event. This is just-in-time training. Sometimes, though, it may be done by some of the other teams that arrive later. So if let's say a disaster medical assistance team arrives and is having some trouble interfacing with the local groups that are there, the Emergency Operations Center, there may be some things that volunteers can help with to help the DMAT teams be more effective. So the DMAT team may then quickly give them some information on what they need to help them, be it contacts or phones or something like that. And the list goes on here, but you get a sense of the kinds of things that one would reasonably want to have present at these centers. I have telecommunications here. This is probably the biggest challenge because communications are always the thing that go down first, and you may not have anything working, and that's why at the very bottom I list runners because that may be the only thing that you're going to have, but you got a lot of volunteers, and many of them will be willing to run around and communicate with the others, so that's an option that you may be able to use. As far as the kinds of documents you want to try and create on site, again, probably doing this electronically will be difficult. There may not even be power. So relying on paper is still probably the best way to go as your backup. I mean, if you have an opportunity to have power, it's great to have this stuff also on a laptop, but I wouldn't count on it. I think providing these kinds of documents, very, very brief documents, would be important. I think especially on the right side here where we have the sign in and sign out sheets, trying to keep track of these individuals can be difficult, but at least if you have some sense of who has reported and then who has gone home, that'll give you an idea of how many people are out there, and so that it makes it more easier to try and manage these individuals in some fashion. So what are the things that one would actually assign volunteers to do? It's obviously not going to be anything very sophisticated. We're not talking about medical care. We're not talking about sophisticated urban search and rescue. But there are lots of very sort of basic things that need to be done. One of the biggest problems in disasters as they go on over several days is you get a lot of donations. People from all over the world will send stuff. Sometimes, though, that stuff isn't very useful, and it's mixed in with stuff that is useful, and you got to sort it through, and that's time-consuming. And for people who are really engaged in trying to manage the event, this can really be difficult. But if you have a bunch of volunteers, it's pretty easy to tell them, we need clothing, sort through this and find clothing and blankets, or sort through this and find food that's in cans that we can send places. So using volunteers to sort through the myriad of donations that sometimes come in is one thing that's useful. Another thing is trying to clean up and manage the debris. This can be hugely dangerous. The problems with debris oftentimes are as dangerous as the event itself. So cleanup efforts can be very important. If there's ongoing flooding, providing people to stuff sandbags is useful. Again, as you can see, this is all pretty basic stuff, but it's very labor intensive. These things require people to do, and so these volunteers can really be helpful in these areas. There are some light search and rescue activities that volunteers can do if they get a little training. And then also to provide services to people who are part of formal response groups. So if there's a family and both the mother and father are needed in some sort of formal response group, who's going to watch their children, or who's going to make sure that they stay informed what's going on. So there are services that may need to be given to some of the families of those who do respond as part of a formal group, and so sometimes the volunteers can assist with that. To sort of wrap up the discussion on the spontaneous volunteers, there's a couple of things that don't really fit neatly into any category, and so I list them here as other issues. So if you do decide to offer some sort of insurance or protection to the volunteers, that whatever policies you are going to use have to be reviewed periodically to make sure they're still in force and that they still apply. Communication is a really critical part of this. Whatever you decide to do in your region, if the people, the volunteers who are going to show up, don't know about it, it makes your job a lot harder. So before the disaster occurs, some strategy to inform the public that how they can volunteer is really important. It's good to have news releases in multiple languages if people don't speak the same language in your area. And it's good to have this done beforehand. Again, once an event happens, it's just too difficult to get this stuff up and running and out before after the event. So before the disaster occurs, you need to put these things together and have them ready so that the announcements of where to go can go out, assuming there's some communication that exists. Also, the public you can let them know how they should volunteer and what skills might be needed in an event. This can happen through schools. Usually parents are oftentimes involved in schools, and so schools are a useful way to disseminate this information. Obviously, Facebook and Twitter, and there's lots of new ways now to get information out to people, and all of these should be used in mobilizing the population before an event so that they have some idea what they should do. And then lastly, if your community does drills and exercises, which many countries do, to try and incorporate the volunteer plan into the training and exercises as well. The longer that the volunteers remain outside the formal process of training and exercises, the harder it's going to be to get them integrated into the system. In order for them to fit in well, they need to practice with everybody else. So some representatives from the volunteer coordination team and some of these volunteer centers should be part of these drills, even if it doesn't work very well, just to start raising the awareness of the formal community coordinators that these entities exist, that there is such a thing as a volunteer plan, and how they might access it. All right, so that's my discussion on the spontaneous volunteers. Now we're going to talk a little bit about more formally organized volunteers, but still at the local level. So we're not talking about the United Nations, we're not talking about international groups, we're talking about groups that are still at the more regional or local level, but that are now formally organized. And so there are various groups that do this. There are service clubs that are common in many countries. The Rotary Club is the one I can think of, but there are other ones. Again, religious organizations oftentimes have formal ways of organizing their members to respond. Community emergency response teams are a possibility. And also many fire departments in many countries, some are, the people that work there are full-time and they're paid, but many of them are volunteers. So many fire departments have volunteer people that are part of their group. So there are sort of more formally organized local responders in the area. And so it's useful to try to reach out to them and try to understand how they might help you in your response. The problems that these groups face is the volunteer aspects of these groups is it's hard to get people to join, and then it's hard to keep them involved once they do join. And we'll go into some of these issues here briefly because it can limit how effective some of these local groups are. They are more organized, so they're a little easier to access, but they face challenges of their own, and as you consider utilizing them, you need to understand some of their issues. Many of these groups may not have the most effective leadership. If they're all volunteer, then the leadership position probably is not paid. There's no money coming into the person that coordinates this, and so you may not get the best person. They oftentimes have to assign tasks to members of their group to stay functional that are not really related to the mission. So, for instance, if you have a community emergency response team, so a group of local citizens that are going to respond to a disaster in a more organized fashion, you have to maintain the group, so there's administration, there's fundraising, and the people don't join these groups because they want to be on administration. They don't join the group because they want to raise money. They join the group because they want to participate and help in a disaster. And so if a disaster doesn't happen for a long time, then this is all they end up doing. They end up doing just building maintenance or just administration, and they start to lose interest. Oftentimes there's not adequate training for the mission that they should perform, and because they don't get called on to respond very often, they start losing interest, and that's part of the problem, trying to keep them involved. So these organizations are not nearly as well trained and as effective as you wish they were. They have their own internal problems, and it limits sometimes how effective they can be. So one of the things that can help in improving how these organizations function in disasters is if there are individuals who run them who sort of understand what's going on with their volunteers and try to minimize all of those negative things we just talked about. Ways to do that is to provide better training. Many countries have free training that's offered, and so making their members aware of this and having them participate in the training can be helpful. And also trying to get them involved in any kind of event locally. If there's a holiday celebration at a mass gathering or a large concert or any kind of large event where the potential for something to happen is there, having them deployed to these events makes them feel more valued and is likely to improve their desire to remain with the group. And then to try to publicly recognize some of these groups periodically in local newspapers or on radio spots if they do participate in one of these events, either like a race or something along those lines. So there are ways to try to bring these volunteer groups more into the activities of the community and make it easier and more likely that they'll be effective when they respond. Okay, and the last group I'm going to talk about briefly, and then I will be pretty much exhausted my time, is the formal relief organizations. And these are the ones everybody knows. So it's the UN, it's the International Medical Corps, it's Médecins Sans Frontières, Doctors Without Borders. These are the groups that everybody really recognizes, and they're very well organized. They provide comprehensive aid, but they have their own issues, and oftentimes, if you don't think about this beforehand, you get to find out the hard way when they show up, and then you run into the problems. So one of the issues for these groups is that they may be fairly unfamiliar with what's going on locally. They don't know necessarily the customs or what the real needs of the population are. And so there's greater potential for friction between the responding groups and the locals. This can be mitigated. This can be you can avoid some of this by reaching out to them earlier and sort of trying to find out what it is, how they work, what it is that they need. It's tough because you got a million other things to do, but it's without any contact with these groups before disaster, it makes it harder then to start from the beginning. So trying to get them to understand, and for them to get you to understand what the needs are going both ways, can sort of mitigate some of these issues and help with the integration. The typical things that you see that go wrong and that can be fixed if you talk to them beforehand is local communities for instance, may expect the wrong kind of aid from a responding organization. The international groups from the Red Cross and Red Crescent generally don't provide acute medical care. They provide support, food, clothing. They may be able to help bring certain resources in, but you're not going to see them acutely establishing hospitals and caring for people. They basically provide support for the population that survives. If you go on their website, you will see that they do, in fact, staff hospitals and whatnot, but those are done sort of later on. That's in part of the recovery phase. So the community is hit by a disaster, there's an initial response phase, and then in the recovery phase, they may actually sponsor setting up of temporary hospitals and whatnot. But that does not happen immediately. So when the Red Cross arrives, don't expect them to bring doctors and medical care. They generally don't do that. Some of the other issues is the length of time these response organizations will remain. The UN and the International Medical Corps will definitely hang around for a while. But many of the more informal groups, what we call the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations, and the United States has several of them, as do many places in Europe. These non-governmental organizations will come in, but they won't stay for very long. They'll stay a couple of weeks and then leave. And so in trying to understand what the length of the time they're going to stay helps in managing some of these issues. Oftentimes, too, the relief groups will expect more from the damaged area than they can get. And so there's a problem. It might be useful to, when you meet with some of the representatives from these large groups, sort of let them know what they should expect as far as infrastructure is concerned and administrative support. Many times it can be fairly good, but sometimes it might not be, and that's useful to get everybody on the same page. There is also, unfortunately, competition between groups. Not so much the ones I just mentioned, but many of the non-governmental organizations that send groups oftentimes compete with each other. This happened in Haiti, where groups from Cuba were competing with groups from the United States, and it did not go very well. So that's something that should be anticipated, and trying to reduce that as much as possible by a more effective management structure, but that's hard to do. And in fact, conflicting management structures are one of the problems, that each organization uses a separate system to run their show, and none of these are interchangeable. So you find that one group simply can't be integrated easily with another group. So finding this out early on is useful. If you talk to, for instance, the International Medical Corps, and you talk to the UN, find out what kind of management structure they use, you might be able to adjust some of that to facilitate their effectiveness when they arrive. And this is my last slide. Essentially, some of the things that you can do is like I said, it's not sophisticated. It takes a lot of effort, but it's what has to be done, is to know what these response groups can provide. So at least your level of expectation as a receiver of aid is consistent with what they can do, and you have some sense of where they should be deployed and what tasks they might be assigned when they arrive. It's a good idea to try to meet with representatives if you can from these organizations. They know their group really well and can provide useful information for how they can be made more effective if they do respond. And the other thing you would want to consider is perhaps limiting how much help you accept from non-governmental organizations you don't know. These are the ones that tend to be the most challenging to work with. They don't report to anybody, they don't answer to anybody, and they can be very helpful if they know their place, but they can also cause a lot of problems. So if you're going to use these unaffiliated groups that sort of just offer their services and bring resources in, there can be issues with that. And probably at this point, given the experience in Haiti, you want to try and limit the aid you accept from others to those that really have a track record and that you know. And if you've never heard of them, they could actually cause more harm than good, and it might be useful to consider not using them. So that's basically it in a nutshell. It's like I say, I wish I had a lot of data to show you that this strategy was implemented in this disaster and it worked really well. But by and large, the use of volunteers is clearly a work in progress, and there's not a real good track record with local communities and how they can make them work. They usually find out after the event, and then they get better for the next one. But it's really, at this point, a very sort of, I don't know, I'm trying to think of a simple word for this, poorly organized and not a lot of evidence for what works and what doesn't. So I'm hoping in the next 5 to 10 years we'll be able to crystallize this better, and maybe we'll see some research on techniques that might be more effective to organize these volunteers. But this is essentially what I've been able to identify as what's out there. So I appreciate your time, and thank you very much.
Prof.